I'm Angie Busick, and I serve as the Vice Chair of the Legislative Affairs Committee for the Greater Williamsburg Chamber and Tourism Alliance Business Council. And I'm with Tom Cosgrove, who is the Vice Chair of the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce. And we are delighted today to be able to speak with Daniel Gade, and he is a candidate for the U.S. Senate. Welcome, Mr. Gade.
Thank you. Great to be here, Angie.
Thank you. So we really appreciate you being here with us to talk about the issues that are of importance to the business community here on the peninsula. And we have 5 questions that we'll be asking you that we've asked all the other candidates who've interviewed with us. And they're on workforce, transportation, healthcare, economy, and the military. And before we get started on the questions, if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes and sharing a little bit about yourself with the people who will be viewing.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and there's nothing that I'd rather be doing right now than speaking to the folks who are the economic drivers of the peninsula. You know, my life has been very interesting, and I've had lots of forks in the road. And I spent 25 years in the U.S. Army, and after that during that time, I went and got a master's degree and a PhD in public policy. And I worked in the Bush administration in wounded warrior policy during a time when the White House and the Congress were in different hands. And so I had bipartisan experience there. And then I worked for 5 years on the National Council on Disability in a bipartisan way to help those who are most disadvantaged in our society, to help formulate the policy that affects those folks. And I'm committed as I go forward here to helping all Virginians succeed and thrive instead of just being a rubber stamp for any particular political party or any particular political figure. So I'm excited about being here. I'm excited about being in this race, and I think that I offer a new, fresh outside perspective. I'm not a career politician, but I have the training, the experience, and the capability to do this work well.
Mr. Gade, thank you for being here and for that introduction. The first topic that we want to cover is on military and defense policy. We don't need to explain to you the role that the defense industry plays in our regional economy here in Hampton Roads. During his 2016 campaign, then candidate Trump advocated for what he termed a great rebuilding of the armed services. Since getting elected, he's approved a number of budget deals with defense spending in excess of $700 billion. So a multi-part question here. Regardless of the outcome of the presidential race, would you support the continuation of the efforts to rebuild the armed services? If so, how would you help to fund that given the increasing cost of military personnel and acquisitions? Or if not, where would you see cuts in the defense budget, and how would you reprioritize funding?
Well, absolutely. So, Tom, a little background on me. You know, I enlisted in the Army when I was 17 years old, and then I went to West Point and spent 20 years as an active duty Army officer, during which time I was deployed to combat. I lost a leg in combat and spent a year in the hospital. So I understand the military healthcare system as well from the user perspective and from the policy perspective. And you're absolutely right when you mentioned in your question that there are some healthcare costs and some personnel costs that we need to control as we look at our military budget in the long run. But let's be totally clear. The military, especially the Navy, is absolutely vital to our national security going forward. Depends, of course, on our military. One of the things that I want to see, and one of the things that I know you on the peninsula are very interested in, is the effort to rebuild the Navy. And as a former Army officer, that sometimes pains me a little to talk about how important the Navy is, but it is absolutely important. And what we need to do is move towards the Navy's goal of having a 355 ship Navy as fast as we possibly can. And the current trajectory gets us there by about 2035. We need to get there earlier than that because it's vitally important to our national security that we have a robust Navy. Now, there are a couple things we can do to control costs. One is we can be creative. For example, I'll stay on the Navy example. We can be creative about how we deploy and redeploy our ships to decrease wear and tear costs and to decrease the time spent transiting from, let's say, the Persian Gulf, for example, to the United States. GAO has talked about this a lot. They think they could cut costs a lot by forward replacement of crews that allows us to keep our ships deployed forward instead of sailing them back, 3,000 miles and then going back over, which causes wear and tear and all of that. So there's some things that the Navy can be doing. There's some things that the other services can be doing in that same regard. All of that makes a lot of sense. But here's what I'd say even more fundamentally. We need to be thinking carefully about the fact that the Constitution puts the right, the responsibility, and the authority to declare war in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That means it's a congressional responsibility, not a presidential responsibility. So what I mean when I say that is we have had president after president after president since the end of World War II who have used their executive branch authority to push military forces out and to accomplish, or to try to accomplish things that I think are not necessarily in our national interest. So instead, I'm proposing that the Congress retake its authority under the Constitution to be the ones who declare war and the ones who decide when our servicemen and women are deployed in harm's way. And that should only occur where there is a vital national interest at stake, where military force is a last resort and a plausible route to a defined end state. And if we can't do all of those things, then the Congress should not allow the president to deploy our forces. So just that will reduce the wear and tear on our forces, which will reduce the amount of money required to maintain them in a high state of readiness, which again, as a national security expert, as a military officer for many, many years, that's something that's very important to me. And I know to a vast majority of the folks in your region.
Great, thank you. Mr. Gade, under the assumption that we would have a COVID vaccine by the end of the year, and with the states and countries, all our states and the countries sort of all being leveled as a result economically of the virus, what 2 or 3 things do you think that Virginia should be doing right now to prepare to be first out of the gate, so to speak, and accelerate our economy and thrive? And what do you think that the business leaders in Virginia should be doing, and how should they be preparing for Virginia to be a role model for a quick economic recovery?
Yeah, such an important question. And I think, we've gone from, maybe overreacting in one way to COVID to now a lot of people are getting kind of complacent about COVID. And so who knows how that pendulum will continue to swing. But COVID is obviously a very serious disease, has killed almost 200,000 Americans, quite a lot of Virginians. And so we need to be very diligent about protecting people who are at most risk. And so as we roll out a COVID vaccine, let's say that we only have, let's say 10% of the population is able to get it, we need to focus that vaccine on people who are most vulnerable. That's the elderly, that's people with pre-existing conditions, and that's frontline workers who are most likely to be exposed to COVID. So I'm talking about nurses and paramedics and potentially people involved in the grocery supply chain. So maybe a grocery store worker might be one of the folks who we want to prioritize there. But at the end of the day, each business is ultimately responsible for taking at least some kind of due diligence in its response to COVID. So I was in a business in Shenandoah Valley the other day called TSSI, and they make defense clothing and equipment and things like that. And one of the things they do is they have a very strict entry policy. And actually the port authority has one of those there in Hampton Roads. And the idea is basically that everybody who comes in is temperature screened, everybody has to have a mask, everybody has to go through a screening process, and it's basic minimum due diligence. One of the things that I think is a good idea, and unfortunately the Democrats, including Mark Warner, voted this down in the recent COVID relief bill, is an attempt to give businesses liability relief for if they are doing the right thing and somebody gets COVID anyway, is the business liable? I think they shouldn't be, provided that they're doing basic due diligence. And the Democrats voted that down, and that was a mistake, because businesses acting in good faith are part of getting our economy back to work. So, the vaccine is going to be slow to get fielded for everybody. if there ever is a vaccine that's good enough, and businesses are going to be key to making smart decisions and helping us grow out of this. But at the end of the day, we have to grow through this. We have to realize that probably COVID is going to be with us for quite some time at a low or chronic level. And hopefully we can get the acute number of cases down a good bit and get our economy back to work.
Thank you. As we talk about the economy, another important aspect of the economy is the workforce. And the Act, WIOA, the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, has been a critical tool in upskilling our underemployed workers and providing opportunities for unemployed individuals. That act is due to be reauthorized in 2021. So what do you see as the current successes and failures, or successes and challenges of WIOA in our workforce system? And what, if any, changes to the policy would you prioritize in its reauthorization?
Well, I worked at U.S. Department of Labor for about 15 months as a political appointee. After I got out of the Army, I was working there helping veterans find jobs. And of course, WIOA is sort of administered by the Department of Labor because they're the ones responsible for workforce development. And clearly, there's a couple of pieces of WIOA that are incredibly important. So for example, of course, we need grants, public-private partnerships to find people who are vulnerable of either job loss without replacement, or people who are currently in a position where they've lost a job that has no replacement. And we need to work to reintegrate those folks. That means reskilling, upskilling. That means, that could mean programs that are taking people who've been out of work for quite some time and incentivizing them to gain and maintain meaningful employment. So there's a couple of parts of WIOA that I think we need to really put our effort into. And then, as we look more broadly, I think that we have, and I'm a college professor, right? So I am a college professor at American University in DC. And for many years before that, I was a professor at West Point while I was on active duty. And what I would say is, despite all that experience, I think we have a problem with a higher education bubble where somehow we've fallen prey to the idea as a country that higher education, that college is the only way to be economically valuable and to be able to provide for your family. And I think that we need to refocus on apprenticeships. We need to refocus on associate's degrees in relevant, important fields. And because there are a whole lot of jobs that don't require college educations that people can still provide for their family and provide value to the economy doing that. So I'm all for apprenticeships. I'm all for job training. I'm all for targeting extra resources at folks who are most vulnerable to job loss, because we know, in the veterans community, that being unemployed is a major threat for not only economic instability, but also things that are even harder than that, like suicide. So reauthorizing WIOA is very important, and finding the parts that work and reinforcing those. And if there are parts that aren't working, reworking those a little bit to make them stronger.
I have a two-part question on healthcare. Do you support or oppose repealing the Affordable Care Act? And regardless of that position, what specific ideas do you have that would expand access to healthcare, keep the costs down, and ensure that the health delivery system remains financially sustainable?
Yeah, Andrea. So the most important part of the Affordable Care Act is its protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And as you can see, and this happens to be, it's just a happy coincidence, there's a photo of me and my family, me and my wife, right behind me on the wall. And what you can see there is that I'm missing a leg. I have a pre-existing condition. And not only that, and that's combat wounds, by the way, but not only that, I'm somebody who has worked with people with disabilities for a very long time, for 15 years or so, since I was working in the White House doing veterans and national level disability policy. So I've worked a lot with people with pre-existing conditions, and I have a pre-existing condition myself. So we need to, of course, protect people with pre-existing conditions. And that's the number one thing that Obamacare did, or the Affordable Care Act did, that we should and can and must continue. Now, my friend Mark Warner put out a false mailer 2 weeks ago and lied about me. And you know, to that, I would say, you know, 2014 called and it wants its campaign strategy back because he said I was against protecting with people with pre-existing conditions. And that's just false. It's defamatory. It's offensive. And he should retract that. But anyway, so that's Obamacare. You know, the most important thing is that there are a couple other good provisions. For example, letting people up to age 26 stay on their parents' healthcare plan makes a lot of sense because, as we all know, people who are in their early 20s are subject to job shifting and they don't know exactly where they're going to go, and they're working through all that, and it makes sense to let them stay on their parents' care. And then a couple of provisions to allow preventative testing to be deductible free and all of that. Those are important parts of Obamacare. Now, we need to, of course, relook some parts of it as well, because like every law, it's not a perfect law. But there are some Republicans out there who say, oh, we must, you know, repeal it root and branch. And that's ridiculous. It's been the law for 10 years. You can't go back and pretend like we're writing this policy fresh. Instead, we have to build on the policy we have. And that means reworking inside the boundaries of the law we already have. So that's sort of the Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act answer there. Now, there are some things we must do if we're going to really take control of our healthcare system. Number one, we must expand health savings accounts. Couple them with price transparency, because when you expand health savings accounts and you couple them with price transparency, what happens is individual consumers, healthcare consumers, patients are subject to market forces that allow them to make wise decisions using what feels like their own money and is their own money to carefully tailor the way they're gonna spend healthcare dollars. So a silly example is if you have a child who is, you know, coughing at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have kind of a choice. And the choice is, do you take them to an emergency room and it costs $350 for the first hour, or do you wait until 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. and take them to an urgent care clinic and it costs, you know, $112? That's a decision that if you're exposed to the price, then you can make a better decision. So healthcare savings accounts or health savings accounts coupled with price transparency will help drive costs down quite a bit using market forces. Number two, we need to sell insurance across state lines. There is absolutely no reason why, just because you live in Virginia, you should only be able to buy health insurance through a Virginia-based company. In fact, you should be able, those companies should have to compete nationwide, and that competition will always drive prices down. I mean, it's, you know, it's basic economics. Third, we have to take control of our pharmaceutical costs. And I've proposed, and I've thought about this quite a lot, and I've proposed that we decrease the cost of acquiring pharmaceuticals by, you know, a lot of it is compliance costs with respect to the Food and Drug Administration. I've proposed that we trust a couple of other countries that if a drug is approved for use on humans in, let's say, France or Germany or South Korea or Japan, that it is automatically retroactively approved in the United States for that same use, because those are accomplished countries. That allows us to control some of our drug acquisition costs and to stay on the cutting edge of our drug costs. And then I just think that whenever possible, what we need to do is we need to be using market forces to drive costs down, not to use price controls or government control, because what we know that will do, what it always does, is cause shortages in provision or health or overconsumption or poor quality or all three. So the idea of Medicare for all just simply will not work from an economic point of view. And then there's some proposals out there, which I agree with, by the way, to allow gig workers to come together in risk pools so they can buy health insurance as if their employer is the same employer, because ultimately health insurance provided through employers is kind of a mistake. And it's an artifact of 1940s price controls that we still are struggling with as a country.
Thank you. And our final question today is on the topic of transportation. And our current transportation system is complex and includes public transit, airports, ports, roads, bridges, tunnels, interstates, you name it. And they're all governed by different entities, authorities, localities, states, and federal government organizations, and even some private entities. This disparate governance and funding impedes efforts to provide a quality and efficient transportation system. So to address these challenges, particularly as localities and regions expand into mega regions, how do we create a structure where all the puzzle pieces fit into an interwoven and more functional system?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, boy, that's a complex one. So a couple of different issues here. One is the federal government clearly has a role in maintaining roads, bridges, and tunnels, of course, plus rail, plus airports in some cases. The federal government clearly has a role here, and most of that is done through the Department of Transportation. Other parts are done through other departments, and I think some streamlining makes sense there. Secondly, state governments can make good decisions on their infrastructure spending if the federal dollars they get are block granted to them, so that the states get to make their own decisions. Because to the maximum extent possible, I'm in favor of federalism and letting the states make wise decisions and make their own spending priorities, so it's not all done in far away Washington, D.C. And finally, I think that we ought to be, to the maximum extent possible, using, if there's going to be a private entity running something like a airport, then public-private partnerships to allow that government funding and that private innovation to together maximize the outcome that the people get. That's the way to go whenever we can get it. So ultimately, what we have here is a very complex system. It's a network. It's a system of systems. And whenever we can get, again, transparency in contracting and public-private partnerships to promote innovation using government dollars, and ultimately to get to a place where we're consistently and constantly improving our infrastructure is really important. But I want to just take a step back and say, look, although everybody complains about the interstates, including me, including like yesterday when I was stuck on I-95 for hours, the interstates are clearly better, objectively better than they were 30 years ago. And 30 years from now, they're going to be objectively better than that. So we need to continue to realize that things are getting better in most of these ways, and we can continue to just be proud of our accomplishments in that. Now, there are, of course, places where that's failing, but we can address those. But it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all woe is me. We have a relatively safe, relatively efficient transportation system that's grown up over time.
Daniel Gade, thank you for joining us here this evening. Angie and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And on behalf of our three chamber sponsors, just thank you and look forward to sharing this conversation with their members and the Peninsula's business community.
Great. Well, I'm a 25-year Army veteran. I'm a public policy leader on a lot of things, but I know when it comes to private business, that the ones who have the most interest in private business and seeing yourself succeed is you and your own businesses. So I'm in favor of deregulation. I'm in favor of tax credits and tax breaks and lower tax rates so that business owners can keep more of the income they make. And ultimately, the federal government needs to have a much lighter touch in regulating individual private businesses than they do now. And so I'll fight for those policies in the U.S. Senate. And if you'd like to help me, please go ahead and give my email address to everybody. Tom, that's totally fine. And you guys have it there. I don't want to say it in the recording. I want somebody to have to take a step out to get it instead of just being able to get it from the recording. But please feel free to pass my email address to anybody who inquires.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks, folks. I really appreciate it.
Yes, indeed.